All right, so today's lecture, Rene Descartes, in many ways, is not only the opening of the unit on modern thought, right, but in many ways it's a cutoff from the things we've been talking so far and the methods we've been looking at so far. Um, Before we jump into Rene Descartes, let's kind of give a historical context. So, the Middle Ages, we just finished covering, right? Medieval theology with Augustine and Aquinas. Um, as we discussed before, in the philosophy in the Middle Ages, focused on theology. It focused on Roman Catholicism in particular. It was an attempt at um, kind of justifying Scripture or the Holy Bible by coming up with arguments to kind of connect the Bible with what people were seeing in their everyday lives and using it to try to answer questions they might have. And the Middle Ages kind of, it depends on which historian you ask. But as a general rule, the Middle Ages ends somewhere at the end of the 1400s, beginning of the 1500s. As you'll see with me, I kind of have the Middle Ages end around 1492, and you'll see why in a few minutes. Um, and so when the Middle Ages comes to an end, it's the beginning of what we call the modern period, or the beginning of the modern period. The modern period does not begin in the 1800s. The modern period begins in the 1500s with the Renaissance, right? The rebirth. We'll talk about that in a second. In the meantime, it's kind of important for us to understand why the Middle Ages ends. The Middle Ages ends because of a confluence of events that destabilized the Catholic Church and its control of Western Europe. And I've got just a small list of some of the things that contributed to the fall of the complete control that the Catholic Church had over Western Europe. Obviously, the Catholic Church is still around, so it wasn't the end of the Catholic Church, but it was definitely the end of its complete control. And you'll see what I mean by that in a bit. So, one of the things that kind of destabilized the Catholic Church's control of Western Europe was Galileo Galilei, the Italian. He was an astronomer and a mathematician, and he proved heliocentrism, which is the idea that the sun is the center of the solar system and that the planets go around it. When Galileo not only had telescope observations and sketches to help prove that, he also came up with the math to help prove that the Earth and the other planets revolved around the sun. And when he did that, Galileo ends up disproving the Catholic Church's Ptolemaic model of the planetary system, which they had had for well over 1,000 years. It's named after Ptolemy, a close friend of Alexander the Great, who we've discussed in this class before. That's how far back. So we're going back to the ancient Greeks. That's where the model comes from, with this idea that the Earth is the center of the universe. And it was important for the Catholic Church to kind of believe in that because it kind of helped prove to them the story in Genesis where God not only creates the universe and Earth within it, but he places Adam and Eve as his favorite creations at the center of the earth and then gives them dominion over the earth. And so the idea that the earth would be the center of the universe would help prove that human beings have like a special place in God's plan. Then Galileo comes in, proves none of that's true, right? The earth goes around the sun, and therefore the earth is not any more important to the sun than, say, Mercury or Venus or Saturn, right? So this kind of begins to shake confidence in the Catholic Church in terms of its ability to know about astronomy. Then we have Christopher Columbus reaching the Caribbean islands and finding the New World for Europe. Um, this discovery by Columbus um, ends up kind of discrediting the Catholic Church's long held teachings concerning the geography of the earth. Now, it's commonly said that like they thought the earth was flat and that everybody thought Columbus was going to fall off. That's not actually the case. Historically, they had known the earth was round since the ancient Greeks, um, from several, um, natural philosophers. What they did think was that there was nothing but ocean on the other side, and so they thought that the three ships Columbus sailed uh, basically were going to be lost. Either they would sink because of storms or some natural disaster. They thought they'd run into sea monsters, which they still believed in back then, or they thought they'd just kind of run out of supplies, run out of water and food, and end up becoming a ghost ship out there in the middle of the ocean. So that's kind of what the Catholic Church had been teaching, right? That there was nothing out there. So when Columbus comes back with, flora and fauna and even a few human beings from the Caribbean islands, this winds up proving that the Catholic Church not only does not know astronomy, it also does not know geography. Um, why this is important for a religious faith, you have to remember that um, for the Roman Catholics for about 1,000 years, the idea was that the Pope and the people working for the Pope, including the theologians, that they were being inspired by the Holy Spirit and that they were the Word of God on earth. So when that word ends up being fallible and disproven by math and science and astronomy and geography, this kind of creates some doubt in terms of, are these men really in the end the voice of God on earth if they can make mistakes? As if that wasn't bad enough, then you have Johann Gutenberg, who creates the printing press and therefore ends the Catholic Church's monopoly on knowledge. You have to remember that before Gutenberg's printing press, the only way to make copies of books was handwritten manuscripts. And as a general rule, the only ones who knew how to write well enough and had the supplies and time to sit around making copies of books were monks who worked for the Catholic Church. And so the Catholic Church could effectively, choose which books made copies of and which books disappeared from history. Um, and more than that, they also wrote only in Latin. And so one of the main reasons in the medieval period people didn't read is because they couldn't read. I mean, the basic reason was they couldn't read because there was no sense in them teaching themselves to read if everything is written in Latin, which they don't speak, right? People spoke French and Italian and English and German and Spanish and Portuguese. So the average person could not read or speak Latin, could not understand Latin. And since all the books were being written in Latin by the monks of the Catholic Church, there was no sense in anybody learning how to read. Well, Gutenberg changes that. When he creates the printing press, now, mostly upper class people who knew how to read and write started writing books that they made lots of copies of and could disseminate across Europe before the Catholic Church could stop them, right? And so this is how you get Galileo able to kind of write his information down and publish it before the Catholic Church could find all the copies of something and burn it all down. So the printing press kind of allowed other opinions, other theories, and in fact, other knowledge that normally the Catholic Church would have destroyed before it could gotten out into the public, right? Then after that, you have the German Catholic priest Martin Luther writing the 95 Theses, which exposed the moral, political, and economic corruption of the Catholic Church. He basically was bringing up examples that were true of, for example, rich aristocrats, part of the nobility, who did terrible crimes like rape and murder, would be forgiven because they were able to pay financial contributions to churches in exchange for forgiveness from the priest. And the poor peasants, um, whose families were starving by this point because of mismanagement of resources by the feudal landlords, when they got caught stealing bread to feed their children, not only would they get hanged, um, but they, according to the Catholic belief, would burn in hell forever afterwards, because they could not afford to pay bribes to be forgiven of their crimes before they were executed. So this is the kind of stuff that Martin Luther kind of begins to expose. So since people begin to see, that they don't know everything, they can no longer control what people think, and that they are morally and politically corrupt, people begin to lose faith in the Catholic Church. And this brings up what is now called the Renaissance, which is the beginning of the modern age. And one of the kind of problems that winds up arising from this Renaissance at the beginning of the modern age is that there winds up being a multiplicity of voices, right? You're talking about, Europe was used to one voice, the voice of the Catholic Church, for 1,000 years, basically from like 495 to 1492. Only the Catholic Church knew things about the world, about science, about the heavens, about death, about medicine, etc. All of a sudden, in the modern age, there's a multiplicity of voices. There's political philosophers and natural philosophers and ethical philosophers and mathematicians and other forms of experts kind of writing books with new ideas. And this ends up creating new doubts in most people in Europe. They were no longer sure what was true. They could not understand what could be believed. You have to remember, when people went to the marketplace at the time of Descartes, and they ran into the bookseller's table, there could be a book about a place called Utopia, written by Thomas More, that talked about a perfect society on an island. Um, you could find a book written by Daniel Defoe called Robinson Crusoe, about a guy who got shipwrecked on an island with a bunch of flesh-eating, cannibalistic indigenous people. You could read the journals of Christopher Columbus. You could read the travels of what's his name, Sir John Mandeville, which was a monk that had supposedly traveled through North Africa and the Middle East. And here's the thing: when you see all these books next to each other, the fact is, out of the ones I just listed, only the travels of Columbus was the only one that was nonfiction. The other ones, the medieval monk traveling, Robinson Crusoe and Utopia, were all fiction, but they were presented as nonfiction. And so, when people, even if people knew how to read early on in the modern period, when they went to the booksellers, it's not like Barnes and Noble where you've got your fiction and your nonfiction section. So the people didn't know what books can we read, what books can we trust, what knowledge is true, who can we believe, right? And so this leads to skepticism. As you may remember from your vocabulary, skepticism is a systematic doubt, right? You begin to doubt what you read, what you hear. A lot of people in today's society, should have a healthy dose of skepticism for very similar reasons as the people back in the time of Descartes. What websites are you reading? What websites are real? What news agencies can you trust? You know, what is it that you're watching on the internet, and is it real or is it not real? Right? Is it true what it's saying or not? Think of certain people that are getting sued now, like for example Alex Jones, who got hit with more than $1 billion in damages for for spreading the lie that the what was it, the Sandy Hook shootings in the elementary school in Connecticut never happened, right? Um, that's just like one example of things that are kind of floating around on the internet. Um, another theory on the internet is that the Earth is flat, right? There's more people that believe the Earth is flat now because of the internet than at the time of Columbus sailing out into the ocean. And they didn't have books, right? But they knew enough. So by the time Descartes comes in, there's a lot of skepticism, a lot of doubt concerning human knowledge. And it becomes a problem that Descartes decides to address in a book called Meditations on First Philosophy. Now you have to remember, Rene Descartes wasn't just the father of modern philosophy. He was an optical scientist. He understood optics quite well. He had developed a number of lenses that we still use on telescopes and even on seeing eyeglasses to this very day. He was also a mathematician, in particular in algebra and geometry. And so Descartes is not just, a philosopher, right? He's a scientist and a mathematician, and he decides to come up with a method to try to address these doubts that people are having. So that brings us to Meditations on First Philosophy. The first thing he writes about is he decides to use what he calls a skeptical method, whereby he's going to examine each of his ideas in his mind one by one. And anytime an idea is clear and distinct and does not allow for doubt, he keeps that idea as knowledge. However, anytime an idea allows for doubt, it's unclear, it's hazy, it's indistinct. If he cannot really kind of explain it, it's more of a suspicion or a belief or an opinion instead of knowledge, then he will toss it out, because he's trying to reduce his mind only to ideas that are clear and distinct knowledge. Okay, the idea is that if he gets rid of beliefs and opinions and feelings and sticks only to clear and distinct knowledge in his head, then it should prevent him from making mistakes. That's what he's kind of planning. So he decides, okay, let me start kind of going through ideas in my head. Let me see what I can keep and what I can get rid of. He decides to begin at the foundation, right? He wants to start off at the bottom. Where did all ideas come from? And so he decides all ideas come from the senses, right? Basically, everything in your head either came directly or indirectly from seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. So he says, let me start off with the senses, and then I'll work my way up from there, since that's where all of my ideas come from, right? So even though at first glance the senses appear clear and distinct, I mean, you can see me on the screen, you can barely hear my voice on the recording, right? So you think that you can hear and see and think and touch and smell, clear and distinct. There's no doubt, right? Well, Descartes points out that actually they do allow for doubt, and he comes up with what we now call the attacks on the senses. And so one example of the attack on the senses that show that the senses cannot be trusted are illusions and mirages, right? We're in Texas. You guys go on road trips. When you go on a road trip out on the highway in the hot summer sun, about 100 yards ahead, you see a puddle of water. We call that a mirage. And people have been seeing those for thousands of years. Even when you know, I mean, you guys are older now, you know there's no water ahead. You know it's just a reflection of heat waves reflecting the blue from the sky above you. Um, you know it's not real. It doesn't stop your eyes from seeing the mirage, right? So even when your brain knows that it's a mirage, your eyes still lie to your brain by making it see the mirage even when you know it's a mirage, right? And the same thing is true for illusions. You pay money to go watch an illusionist or a magician trick you. You know that they're tricking you. And yet, as far as your eyes can see, the person disappears, or the person gets chopped in half with a saw in a box. And so the point Descartes making is that even when the brain knows it's being lied to, the eyes continue to lie to the brain, right? Second example he comes up with are, um, you know, nightly dreams, right? Um, and the occasional daydream. And so one of the things he points out is that your brain lies to you every night when you dream. Now, some of you might say, "Oh, I don't dream." You do dream. Every single person dreams, whether you remember it or not. And when you dream, um, your 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 brain convinces itself that it's somewhere else, right? Or that sometimes even that you're someone else. Um, raise your hand if you've ever had a nightmare. Maybe you've been chased by the boogeyman, or if, as we like to say in Spanish, been chased by the cucuy. Um, when you wake up from the nightmare and you've been chased, what are some of the symptoms of your body's behavior? You sweat as if you've been running. Your heart is racing as if you've been running, right? Um, you're disoriented. You're feeling panic, um, and so one of the points that Descartes would make in this case is that um, the only reason you're running in the dream is because you're so convinced it's real that your fight or flight instinct kicks in and you run, right? And then the running is so realistic that even your autonomous responses, like short, fast breaths, like sweat glands, and like a heart rate, you don't control those. Another part of your brain does, right? Like your conscious mind doesn't control those, and yet they are reacting as if you were running, right? The same thing can be true of those dreams where you wake yourself up because you're chewing on something you thought you were eating, or when people have sexual dreams. They're in all of these, the physical body is reacting automatically to what it perceives to be real stimuli that are actually just dreams, right? So again, the senses can be deceived, right? What is true in terms of hearing and seeing and smelling and touching is not necessarily clear. Now, some of you are like, well, if I can't touch it, guys, in the dream, you can feel touch, right? That's why we have sexual dreams. Sexual dreams are a product of touch, and you feel like you're touching whoever the partner is or the lover is, right? So you want to chew on the food because you can feel it in your hands when you're bringing that burger up to your mouth, right? Like in dreams, you do actually feel the sense of touch. And the last example is madness, right? If you were to walk into a mental institution, or back then what they called an asylum, and ask, people that were in there to raise their hand if they were perfectly sane, everybody would raise their hand. Part of what makes a person, you know, mad, in using the old language, is the fact that they think that they're sane, right? And so one of the points here in this final attack is that mental illness like schizophrenia, where or psychotic breaks, where you hear and see and smell and taste and touch things that really aren't there, um, shows that the brain can be extremely convincing, creating things to see, hear, smell, and taste and touch that are not there, right? Um, and so basically the senses wind up turning out to be unclear, indistinct, and they allow for doubt. So right off the bat, we can't even trust what we normally trust. So for Descartes, right, the senses and all ideas arising from them must be cast out. We must throw them out, leading to an overwhelming doubt of everything, whereby we can no longer be sure who we are. Am I really me? Am I William Nolan? Is the life that I've been living the real life? Are my memories real? Um, do I even really have a body? Right? Does that body look like what I think it looks like? Um, is the world that I've known even a real world, or is it some kind of virtual reality? Is the history of this world a real world? Um, you know, how can we be sure that any of this is true, right? Um, there's a great episode of Rick and Morty, um, where Rick and Morty like you follow the cartoon, and there's this kind of like older guy that is working in a carpet store that he kind of takes over, and he gets married and he has kids, and he raises the family with this carpet store until he grows old and his grandkids have grown up, and then he kind of like passes away of old age. And it turns out that when he passes away, Rick and Morty wake up because it turns out that the this life that they lived as someone else was a virtual reality game that they were playing, right? And it keeps a score by like how long you live and the kinds of experiences you have or whatever. Um, this is like a perfect example of what Descartes is talking about here, right? There's this ability to doubt one's very existence because in the end we cannot trust what we see and hear and smell and taste and touch. The senses cannot be trusted, even before virtual reality, right? People had been struggling with mental illness since people have been around. So what exactly is real? Um, and so Descartes, you know, decides if I do get rid of everything in my history, in my biography, in my mind, in my memory, if I get rid of my body itself, what's left, right? And so Descartes writes that one thing he cannot doubt is that he is something that is in the process of doubting, that he is a doubting thing. And doubting, right? Like so he can doubt that he has a body, but he cannot doubt that he is doubting, right? He has this intimate experience of a mental process called doubting that is taking place. He tells us in Latin, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. And he becomes intimately aware in the core of his being that although his body might not be real, his mind is, right? Um, he says, let's assume that um, my mind is being deceived by a demon or an evil genius, right? On the left, we see a picture here of like a brain kind of being controlled by a computer, making it think it's in a body and it's running a morning jog. Um, you know, Descartes points out like maybe the body isn't real, maybe my life isn't real, maybe my who I think I am is not real, but there's still something that is being lied to, right? There's still something that is kind of doubting its own existence. If there is a demon or an evil genius playing a trick, there's something that's being played a trick on, right? And so he recognizes that he's what we call a mind, right? That the mind is the one part he cannot doubt, that he's a thinking thing. So then what's next, right? Um, he as of at this point, the only thing Descartes is sure of is that he's a thinking thing, but that's it. Like it's just kind of floating in darkness, in the empty void, right? That has nothing of existence within it. Um, and this brings kind of Descartes to edge of what we call solipsism. Solipsism is this kind of idea that the only thing you can be sure of is your own awareness, and everything else, as far as you know, is an illusion being played out. So that basically, even I'm not real, right? Like me and your parents and the people you know, and the people you see on the street and in the restaurants. These are all just kind of like figments of your own mind, right? You're like a god floating in nothingness, creating a universe around itself to entertain itself with, right? That's solipsism. And that's where Descartes finds himself at the end of the first couple of meditations, because his book is broken up into 5 or 6 meditations. Um, so how does he move forward, right? Like, how does he not just shut down and go nuts at this point? So Descartes begins to search inside this mind for any ideas in this mind that exist there independently of the senses, right? In other words, is there any idea left in there that does not have to rely on seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, right? Ideas that he can kind of call innate ideas. Not that he means that we're born with these ideas in the brain already. What he means is these are ideas that exist without relying on seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, right? And he finds two innate ideas: infinity and God. Um, so, for the purpose of this lecture, we're just going to focus on God, right? And he says God is the concept of a perfectly good creator, right? And since the concept of God is as a perfectly good creator, um, and it's not something that we've ever seen, heard, smelled, tasted, and touched. For Descartes, that proves that that idea of God must have been kind of planted in there by the creator of the mind, which is God. And so, this idea of God, right, which turns out to be a reality of God, would not allow for his creation, Descartes' mind, to exist being deceived throughout his entire life, right? Because that would not be the definition of good, which is not the definition of perfect. Therefore, Descartes recognizes that it's unlikely that a demon or evil genius is deceiving his mind about having a body or about being in the world. Since the senses are created by God, right, and the senses tell us we have a body and that we're in the world, and God is perfect and therefore good and not a deceiver, then it follows, according to Descartes' argument, that God created Descartes and the rest of us, gave us not only a mind but gave us senses and a body to understand the world around us, and therefore it turns out you really do have a mind, but you also have a body, and that body connects the mind to the world around it, right? So in other words, everything is back to normal. If this argument seems weak, that's because it is, right? It's a rather weak argument. He never really proves that God exists just because God's an idea in our mind, right? And he never proves that it's an innate idea, since we learn about God through other people, like our parents. Um, so, it's not the best argument. But for now, let's just go with it. So, Descartes now, right, recognizes there's a God, that God created us, and we're minds and bodies, right? Since the senses are created by God, they cannot lie in the first place, right? And human beings are what we now call dualistic, right? We are two things. We are mind and body. We're both. This creates a duality in human beings. The duality of the mind and the duality of the body, right? But Descartes has to explain the errors and mistakes of the senses, since God made them, but God's perfect, right? And so his explanation is that the errors in the senses stem not from the senses themselves, but they stem from the human mind's free will, right? Remember, for people after Christianity, there's this idea of free will. Human beings are free from cause and effect. We can make our own decisions. We're not programmed in the same way that like animals, like dogs are, um, or robots, right? And so for Descartes, since human beings are free, that means that they're able to make decisions that are faulty before the senses have had sufficient time to gather all the information required for a wise decision, right? And so the point that Descartes making is that when your mind mistakes beliefs, feelings, and opinions for knowledge, and you have not allowed enough time for your senses, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, to gather all the information it needs, we fill in the gaps of knowledge with these feelings, beliefs, and opinions, and that's why we make mistakes. For example, when you're dreaming, you're reacting to fear instead of stopping to actually collect data. If you collected data, you would realize, for example, that you don't remember how you got there, right? You don't remember who this guy is that's chasing you. You don't remember why he's chasing you. So, you know, because you don't kind of think your way through it and gain real knowledge of it, you react like an animal and you fear and you flee and you run, right? And so the point Descartes making is that the mistakes we make are our own fault because we react instead of thinking through. We fill in gaps instead of gathering more knowledge, right? And so that's kind of Descartes' response by the end of it. His recommendation, obviously, is that we start to collect information, see things, hear them, smell them, taste them, touch them from all, from 360 degrees, from all perspectives, right? Test it, test your perceptions, right? He does still think you need a healthy dose of skepticism, one that kind of attacks your beliefs, your opinions, and your feelings, because for Descartes, those are not reality. In any case, some of you might notice, like, what later is the beginning of what later becomes the scientific method, right? Descartes is asking us to engage in observation, right? And so that's our first steps towards the scientific method, then, right? He doesn't create the scientific method. He kind of just points us in the right direction. It's not until we get to Francis Bacon and Isaac Newton that we actually get the scientific method the way we know it today. But Descartes definitely took our first steps in that direction. And that's why we give him the credit for being the father of modern philosophy. That's it for Descartes. And, there will be some lectures missing. Um, I'm not covering um, some of the. If the lectures are missing, you just go with the videos and the notes instead. Okay. Um, some of the lectures are pretty straightforward, so I don't think you'll need my lecture on every single one of them. So just go with that. Okay. I'll see you in the next lecture.